I got it. Okay, welcome everyone to one of our fake lectures. This is a practice section to make sure that we get the gear right, and we've been playing with setup and what have you. But we don't want to waste your time, so there actually is something real to talk about. And the fake lecture today is, why are there so many birds, also known as courtship in birds, which is just fascinating because it's different from us and we get to talk about sex. So, birds, it turns out, are still, not only are they still dinosaurs, but they're still very successful. There are 3 times as many species of birds as there are mammals. So the mammals not only did not die out with the big asteroid, but they came back gangbusters. So let's talk about them. This is a sample from a study someone did showing that, as you see the dark blue on the right, that's the number of fish species in this particular study. And you can see the light blue is birds, and look at mammals down there in the orange. So that's a comparison of the number of species from one study. So our question is, why? Well, Chuck, my buddy Charles Darwin, had an opinion on that. And as you know, in 1859, he wrote on the origin of species and came up with this idea that he explained to the world of natural selection. Well, a few years later, he did a book called The Descent of Man and came up with a competing but similar idea called sexual selection.
Are we supposed to interrupt you and try to test?
Yeah, please interrupt.
Yeah, so isn't it the descent of man and selection in relation to sex?
Yes, thank you. Descent of man.
You're supposed to repeat the question.
No, well, as Mark, it worked.
Did it work, Mark?
It worked.
Okay. But I will remember. Okay, The Descent of Man was the proper name of the book.
And selection in relation to sex.
Yes. And those 2 topics, natural selection and sexual selection, are what I'm going to be talking about today. So 3 kinds of courtship in this talk. First is natural selection, where the male is signaling health to the female. And as you may know, in the bird world, females run the show. They're in charge. They make all the important decisions. Number 2, females choose males by appearance or behavior, and that would be sexual selection. And then finally, the 3rd way is what happens when males force females. It's an ugly side of this topic with a surprising ending. So, as it happened, when I was putting this talk together, the New York Times did a story on turkeys, and it was perfect because the pictures with that article just melded really nicely. So the pictures are from the New York Times, but when you see arrows and words on the screen, that'll be my work. Okay, to start with, please notice just how handsome these little devils are. These are 3 male turkeys in their full glory. This is mating season regalia, and they are dressed to the nines. But when it's not mating season, this is a male turkey. You notice he's much slimmer, very plain. He still has that tuft of feathers coming out of his chest, but he looks very different. Also, in the non-mating season, males fight for dominance. It just happens that I was describing this to a random man, I don't even know his name, and he said, "That's funny. I had some turkeys fighting in my backyard and I filmed it." So he sent it to me. And you get to see just how forceful and violent this is. Now, in a second, in the background, you're going to see a female who appears to be disinterested in this whole conflict.
No, I think it can go uninterested. Disinterested, the judge was.
A judge is disinterested, and we've got our fingers crossed for a certain courtroom exercise happening back east. Okay, well, you get the idea. Males are struggling here for dominance over each other. And when that is finished, look what happens. The males declare peace among themselves and they group back together in their buddy relationships, and it's almost like the fighting didn't happen. Can't we be friends? Except they know, the males here know who won the combat, and that plays a role later on. So here they are, mating season, and everybody is very well dressed. Only the top male gets to mate. That's the result of, that's a partial result from the combat. Okay, first we're going to talk about natural selection. So I want you to imagine that you're a female turkey and you're looking at these two handsome devils, and you only get to choose one feature of their being dressed. Would you choose, come on, would you choose those magnificent tail feathers if you were the female? Would you choose the breast feathers that are reflecting ultraviolet light? Would you go for the beard, that tuft of feathers on the chest? Or maybe the caruncles? That's my favorite, those red knobs on their neck. How about the snood? A piece of tissue. I don't know who came up with these names, but the snood is a piece of tissue that hangs over the male beak. And then finally, the skull cap, that blue tissue. Well, we put our female turkey to test here, and she has an answer. It's hard to see here, but there's a female under that male. So they're mating, and she chose him in this study because of the snood, that tissue that hangs over the beak, which I find like really interesting. So the question is why? Why did she choose that? And it turns out the snood can change color and size, and it isn't just beautiful. Look at that thing. Isn't that exciting? It isn't just beautiful. If you have a particular kind of snood, it's a sign of a disease, coccidiosis. Coccidiosis kills baby turkeys, and it can sometimes make the males sick. So the point here is the female turkey can look at the male, and by looking at that snood on his beak, get an indication of how healthy he is. Here's an image of coccidia, the disease, and what you're looking at in the blue picture there is the egg. This is an oocyst, it's called, and they are practically indestructible. You can hit that sucker with hammers, you can throw it in salt water, you can dry it out, it just doesn't matter. It'll stay alive and infect the next bodies that come along. There are similar diseases that humans get. If you look at the list on the right, the bottom one is toxoplasma that you get from cats. You might have heard that we don't want human females that are pregnant. We don't want those women to change the cat box, because a cat that goes outside will pick up this disease, toxoplasma, and it's in their poop, it dries out, and it's so microscopic that it's in the air and you can breathe it in, and then you're infected for the rest of your life. For some people, it's not a big deal. For others, it can be damaging. So that's our version of what the turkeys are going through. Here's the life cycle of the disease. The turkey at the top, I think these are chickens actually. The chicken at the top is infected, poops on the ground, which they do a lot. My girlfriend has 6 chickens, and I can't believe the production from those birds. So another bird will come by and eat a piece of food that has some of those eggs in it, and then that bird is infected. And before long, it spreads to the entire population. So what we just saw was an example of how beauty indicates fitness. This is natural selection. You look at a turkey's snood and you can tell some signal of health. Question.
So the beauty fitness is synonymous with the health
Yes.
fitness?
Yeah.
Okay.
Biologists are trained to look for this because natural selection is a driving force in evolution, as everyone knows. And the book that I'm about to talk about says there's a bias in biology. There it is. The book is The Evolution of Beauty by one of the world's great ornithologists, Richard Prum. I remember reading articles on his byline in Scientific American decades ago. And I read this book and fell in love with it. So I've now read this book a bunch of times. I really recommend it. And mostly what you're hearing today is a book report on The Evolution of Beauty by Richard Prum. So let's go into a little more detail as he explains it in the book, and I'll do my best to do justice to it. So we're going to use his book to talk about females choosing males by sexual selection, which includes male-to-male combat, as you saw in the turkeys. It also includes female choice, and this is an example of the violence that we saw. But wait a minute. In natural selection, we looked for a feature that indicated health, natural selection. But what about all those other things? Nobody apparently has tied the tail feathers to health in male turkeys, or the skull cap, or those magnificent caruncles at the base of the neck. We don't know if the female thinks that makes them healthy, or in this case, isn't the female just saying, I like it, and that's all you need? If the female turkey has a sense of aesthetics, a sense of beauty, that's all that's required for sexual selection. So, in this case, we have another mating scene between the turkeys. In this case, the winner is the turkey that she selected just because she likes him more than the other turkeys. And not to give too much cognition to turkeys, it doesn't have to be anything extensive, right? She's not drawing up a list. Charles Darwin, before he got married, made up a list of the pluses and minuses of marrying the woman he ended up with. And the minuses included things like if he marries her, he won't get to read as many books. So there's a nerd for you. But female turkeys don't have to go into all that detail. She just has to look at him and say, you're good. This other guy over here is bad. You're the winner. Sexual selection. Okay. From Richard Prum's book, there's a lot of talk about this bird. The only way you, as a human being, would ever get to see this bird is probably in a zoo, because the great Argus pheasant that you're looking at lives in the jungle in New Guinea and other Asian areas, and it hangs out in jungles and is very aware of its surroundings. So if a human approaches, it'll skedaddle, it'll get out of the way. You would never see one unless you're a trained ornithologist and you have months to dedicate to the project. But thanks to those people who've done the research, we get to talk about the great Argus pheasant. What you're looking at is a male, and I want you to notice the huge feathers toward the back of the bird. When it's mating season, wait till you see what that male bird does. Ooh. Look at that. This is one of the most incredible things. Not only does he spread his tail feathers out, but look at the female in front. she's right near the center and she's saying, I'm checking you out, buddy, but don't take anything for granted. And now notice the complexity of this display. Where her eyeball is looking, can you see in the center of the male, there's a blue spot? That's his head. He's looking out to see what she is looking at, because everybody is very interested in this whole exchange. So she's studying him and he's studying her to see if he did it right. And now notice another thing, that from her point of view, notice what look like balls on the feathers of the male going from top to bottom. Notice that the spheres get bigger as you go toward the tip of the feather. Well, to the female, that's something called forced perspective. To the female, those balls all look the same size. So this male very cleverly organized all of those displays to produce a particular effect. And the argument here is he didn't do it, she did. She would only choose males over time that more closely resemble what you're seeing in this picture. The great Argus pheasant. Okay, so here comes a dispute now. Here's another picture of the same thing, not as good a picture. If you take those feathers and look at them closely, the dispute is that bias that I mentioned earlier. People want to look at that and say somehow these feathers are proving to the female that the male is healthy. Well, Richard Prum's argument is that, here's a close-up of one of those feathers. That argument is impossible. You would have to look at every polka dot, every one of those spheres. Notice how the spheres are shaded from light to dark to give them kind of a three-dimensional quality. You would have to explain, for this to be natural selection, you're going to have to explain how every part of that feather indicates health. It's an impossible job. You can't do it. So the argument in this book is, isn't it more practical to just assume that aesthetics play a role here? The female is choosing that feather because she likes it, not because it's indicating health. And that way, you can explain how over time that feather would get more and more elaborate until you produce what you're seeing. Come on. So that's the argument from Richard Prum. And once you have heard this argument, you're willing to accept that female birds have a sense of aesthetics, then you can start to explain what you see in the natural world. So, sexual selection explains how those apparent balls take on the forced perspective. And finally, we get to what's the matter with these females? How come they're not jumping up and down excited because of all this elaborate display that the males are putting on? Another example would be our friend the peacock. The traditional explanation for a peacock is that the males have that fantastic array on their tails because they're telling females, I've lived this long with this handicap. After all, if you have a big tail, you can't fly very well. And that means I've stayed away from tigers and didn't get killed, so I'm proving how healthy I am. But then you look closely at this display, and it can't be that simple. It just can't be that he's saying, look how healthy I am. Look at the details. And once again, you've got three-dimensionality in each of those, what we call eyeballs in the tail feathers. It's got to be that she is choosing him for beauty. Now, to go back into Charles Darwin's time, people did not want to give females agency. And so back in Charles Darwin's day, women could not be scientists, for example. Women were seen as weak, hysterical, which comes from the whole having of a uterus kind of thing. And so the argument today from men like Richard Prum is that in order to talk about birds with agency, there's a little leakage into human beings. It's like, wait a minute, if you say birds have power, aren't you also saying that human females have power? And today we're doing better. I mean, we have a vice president of the United States who's a female, but the argument comes from the 19th century when that was a bigger issue. Okay, so the peacock is clearly telling us that aesthetics matter here. So why would males do this? I mean, if we're talking about chimpanzees, the males would just come around and beat up the females and force them to do what they wanted. So why would these birds go along? Here's part of the answer. You're looking at somebody holding a chicken upside down and spreading out the feathers. This is a male cloaca. And can you see a little white dot in the center? That's a penis. That's all there is. Here's a female cloaca, and it's about the same size. So when birds are mating, that tiny little penis injects sperm onto the surface. The female's job is to produce mucus so that the sperm have a way to swim into her reproductive system. So here's a picture in French of two chickens mating. Now this is less than half a second. So they touch their cloacae together for a fraction of a second, and that's all there is. You can see the sperm swimming down her oviduct, and then it fertilizes an egg. And after the egg is fertilized, the next step is to put a shell around it, and then the shell works its way out of the female. So the question here is, why would males go along with this severe judgment of the females? And the answer is, they don't have a choice. If the female doesn't want to mate, he's not going to get his DNA into the next generation. And they know this. So why would males go along? Because the female controls the mating. And a male that wants to mate has to go along. Let's look at some examples of other birds. So Richard Prum from the Evolution of Beauty spent a lot of his career in South America studying manakins. There are 54 species of manakins, and the colors you see here in South America are different species in different locations. So he had to travel in jungles and impossible places to find, he's the first person to see some of these manakins. And let's look at some of the results of what he found. The big find is that it isn't just pretty feathers that matter here, it's behavior. So watch this. This is a golden collared mannequin, and watch the acrobatics. Backflip and singing the whole time. There he is again. Here comes a moonwalk from the red-capped mannequin. Is that cool or what? This is a club-winged mannequin, and when I was reviewing this, I couldn't get the video to work. So I'm going to jump out and click on it on the side. And what you're listening for is a sound. Hello? Oh, do I have to do it here? Yeah. Hear another bird?
Yeah.
There you go. Come on.
Love it.
What's extraordinary about that is what this male bird had to do to his body to produce that sound. The pictures you're looking at are the ulna bone in a bird wing. So on the left is what evolution has produced in ulnas in birds. So birds all over the world, you can recognize the ulna because they look the same. They all look like that. Only this one bird of all the birds in the world has a weird ulna. And you can see the male in the middle and the female on the right. This ulna is solid bone, where all other birds, their bones are hollow. It comes from the evolution of flight and dinosaur ancestry. So why is this one bone not only solid, but it's got all these bumps and grooves on it? And the answer, of course, is that it had to produce a bone that was so strong that it could produce that sound you heard. Otherwise, it couldn't do it. Here's a close-up of how this works. Notice that some of these feathers are not straight and pretty. They're kind of misshapen. Well, these are the two feathers. The one on the left is the instrument that scrapes against the feather on the right. Can you see all those little grooves? The bird has to produce a sound by rubbing two feathers together. And in order to do that, it has to have a very strong, solid bone, ulnar bone in its wing to produce the sound. Well, what's very strange about that is the comparison that you saw.
Oh. So that sound that that bird was making had nothing to do with its vocal cord?
That's right. It's not a song. It's a feather rubbing thing that it's doing. And it had to sacrifice its flight ability to do that. So here's a bird. Now, birds are made for flying, right? That is the birds we're talking about. And here's a bird who can fly less well because he needs to produce a sound that pleases the female. He's giving up the most important characteristic of his animal life to please the female.
Why would the female ulna match his when she doesn't need to make a sound?
Great question. Why does the female ulna have to be distorted the way the male is? And it has to do with what it takes to produce that ulna. They're passing along the structure to both males and females. It's like you could ask, well, why do human males have nipples? We don't breastfeed babies, but we have nipples. Same kind of argument. So this was a mannequin who gave up some measure of his ability to fly to produce this sound. And it doesn't get more profound than that, because this is not just displaying health or beauty. This is, I'm going to display beauty at the sacrifice of my ability to get food and fly around. Here's my favorite. This is a blue mannequin, and watch what they do to impress the female. Now, the female is going to be on the left, and she's green.
I'm bored.
Is that incredible? It's actually more incredible than what you're seeing, because these mannequins, the males, get together every day and practice what you're looking. This is a circus act, for Pete's sake. They get together every day and practice this so that when the female shows up, they're ready. And they've showed as many as 5 blue mannequins cooperating this way. What's interesting is if she likes the performance, by the way, she's not going to stop here. She's going to fly off to watch other male groups practicing their circus act. And if she decides this is the best one, she's going to come by and she's going to indicate that, okay, you guys win, I'm ready to mate. And guess what? Only one of the blue mannequins gets to mate with her, only the top dog. So now you got to ask, well, then what's in it for the other guys? If blue mannequins number 2, 3, and 4 don't get to mate, any ideas?
Practicing for next year.
They're practicing for next year. What those birds are saying is, I'm going to dedicate my life to this, so someday the top guy will either die of old age or get eaten by a cat or whatever. When he's gone, then I have a chance to mate. I'll spend the rest of my life hoping to get into position to be the guy that gets to mate. That's a tough selection process. This chart is showing some of the work that Richard Prum and others have done, classifying all the behaviors that you saw from mannequins. And it turns out that if you study it closely, you can produce a cladogram, which you see on the left there. The original, the oldest version of behavior that pleased the females was a kind of dive bombing that you can see in the upper right there, where the male would be very high in the sky and then dive down like a bomber and come very close to the female and then zoom back up into the sky. And it got more and more complicated from there. And you can see in the bottom picture, there's a mannequin that jumps between 3 or 4 different trees and he sort of bounces around like a circus act, all based on stepwise incremental change that goes from one kind of bird performance to another. So this is just a reminder, female choice has created 95% of bird species. But it gets even more exotic, believe it or not. So let's talk about our friends, the birds of paradise in New Guinea and other parts of Asia. This is a Western Parotia. What you're looking at is a female standing on a branch, and she's about to evaluate the performance of a male down there on the ground. He has cleaned up the ground. He's thrown away any leaves that might have fallen or sticks or whatever, so that he's on stage and she's going to judge everything he does. And there's a moment here where his performance reaches a peak. See the yellow flash? There are so many different varieties of birds of paradise, but the bottom line comes down to this: the males are putting on a performance to impress the female. Bowerbirds, also in Asia, New Guinea, and Australia. And you can see from this picture that the males clean up the area, like that last picture you saw, and then they build a structure. It might have a central pillar that's decorated or built like a cave or a tunnel, like you see on the bottom there. What they have in common is the whole point here is that the male wants the female to feel safe. Here's what that means. In this dramatic picture, you can see a female inside the tunnel and a male on the outside, and he's got a snail shell in his beak. And then if you look around his feet, he has displayed a whole array of snail shells saying to her, "Ain't I cool? I'm here to impress you." What she's saying is, "Leave me alone. I'm in here to judge the effectiveness of your art display. And if you come around the back and try to mate with me, I've got an escape route out the front, and I can leave if you get too energetic." So what bowerbirds have in common is the ability to persuade the female to take her time and evaluate the art display that he puts on. Here's one of those central maypoles, they call them. This is a McGregor's bowerbird. Here's a central pillar, but this time it's built like a mushroom so that the top spreads out. This is a yogelkop bowerbird. Same idea, by the way. When the female gets in there, she'll be on one side of that central pillar and the male on the opposite side. And if he moves, she will move to stay in a position so that that central post is between them, because she is going to insist on taking her time to evaluate his work. Okay, we're at the last part of this talk now, and we're going to talk about forced mating. So this is a cladogram showing on the left. You see the chicken there? That chicken represents over 95% of all bird species on Earth. Most birds do this. And the point of this graphic is right here. When that chicken was in the embryo, when it was in the egg developing, there are some genes that say, go ahead and start growing a penis, but then stop. As a matter of fact, not only stop, but go backwards. So 95% plus of birds in the world, the males don't have a penis, as you saw in the chicken picture earlier. Well, what about that 5%? In the middle, you can see a duck. And on the far right at the top, that's a rhea related to ostriches and other very large non-flying birds. They grow a penis. And so what we're going to talk about now is what happens. What's the difference between birds that have a penis, and we've already seen what happens when they don't. Come on. Ah, there it is. So this is less than 5% of male birds on Earth that have a penis. And some researchers have said it's like 3%. So it's extreme. Another cladogram. On the left, you see the penis of a chicken, and the little arrow is pointing to it. A quail, just as another example. And then in the middle right, you can see the penis of a duck. And a duck is one of the birds, of course, that is growing a penis. And on the far right is the penis of a goose. And believe me, it gets way more strange than this picture. This is an Argentine lake duck. And this very fortunate picture was taken to show that the penis is longer than the rest of the duck's body. And so immediately scientists who want to try to figure this out, it's like, what is going on here? And the reason it's confusing is that if you took a male duck and dissected it when it's not the breeding season, they don't have a penis. They grow that penis in mating season. And so obviously it has to be built differently from, say, humans and other animals that we're familiar with. Some mammals, for example, even have a bone in the penis. It's called a baculum. Bears, raccoons, they have very strange looking bone. Humans don't have that bone, but what we're used to is mammals using their penis and it inflates with blood. It's very different in ducks. Ducks have what look like testicles, but really they're fluid sacs. And when it's time to mate, those fluid sacs explode and push fluids into the penis. Now the penis is hidden inside the duck's body. It's inside out, like a sock. And so when it's time to mate, those fluids are pumped into the penis. It explodes out of the male and into the female, and it's all over in less than a second. Believe it or not, I mean, it's very strange. So in this graphic, you can see a male mating with a female. So a reminder here that like other birds, the female is choosing the male that she's going to mate with. What's happening in this picture is the male on top has been rejected. She chose a different male, and he says, oh yeah? So he will try to force himself. And in some cases, 3 or 4 males at the same time will try to force themselves on the female, injuring her or even drowning the female. Talk about extreme. So does this go against the sexual selection arguments from earlier? Does this mean that the males win just because they have a penis? keep that question in mind because there's a surprise ending. All right. Try to imagine that you're the first researcher that saw this duck penis. And remember, for a long time, people thought ducks did not have a penis because it only grows in mating season. Or this one. I mean, what's going on here? It's corkscrew shape. It's got all kinds of grooves and bumps and knobs on it. It's like, what is going on? And then a woman, this is a Patty something, her name is going to come up in a minute. The scientist that finally figured all of this out started with a bunch of questions like, why is that male penis as weird looking as it is? And why is it corkscrewed counterclockwise? So she dissected out the female vagina, and that's it in the upper picture. The female vagina is also corkscrewed, but in the opposite direction. Well, now it's more confusing than ever. How do you figure this out? And the solution is as amazing as the answer. Here's what she did. She went to Central California, where it turns out, just by luck, there's a ranch that breeds mallard ducks with a different species, Muscovy ducks. And what they want to produce are hybrids that are half mallard and half Muscovy. But the mallards won't mate with the Muscovy, so the humans have to intervene. And so what they do at this ranch is they'll take a mallard duck, put him next to a female mallard, he gets excited, and then they take him into a different room, and you see that straight glass tube? They put that on his cloaca, he ejaculates into it, and then they manually fertilize the other duck, the other species, to produce this hybrid. Well, she says, Patty Brennan says, that's perfect. This is the setup I needed to try to figure out how ducks do what they do. So you see those glass tubes with corkscrews on them? That's what she used to test various hypotheses. Notice that one of the glass tubes is corkscrewed clockwise, and the other one is corkscrewed counterclockwise. And so she had these mallard ducks mating with different tubes. We already know they'll mate with a straight tube. But what happens when the tube is the same corkscrew as his penis? Well, it's more successful than when the corkscrew is the opposite. So what does that tell us about how ducks mate? I mean, talk about weird. What happens is this. When a female chooses a male, she'll stretch her body out so that the penis can go through the vagina and fertilize her eggs. When she's being forced, you get what you see on the screen. Notice that the penis has now gone off into a blind pouch, a little side tunnel, and his sperm will not make it to where the eggs are. In other words, she's fighting back. She's saying,
No.
yeah, this is a duck's way of saying no. And the penis is off on a little side pocket and will not fertilize the eggs, and it's very successful. That's her name, Patricia Brennan from Yale University. She was a graduate student under Richard Crum. So the female still controls the mating. Even though this male duck is forcing his way on her, the shape of her vagina is challenging the whole operation. And look at the number, 95% failure of forced mating. That's how successful the female is, even when it looks like she's being forced. Ah, there's her name again. That was a fascinating part of the book. So we're near the end here. How successful are birds? Here's another graphic. And on the left, you see the species of birds. And from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, they estimate that there are 18,000 species of birds. And on the right, you can see that mammals have something like 5,000. Now, that's the biggest number I've ever seen for species of birds. So even if it's 10,000, which is more common, there are twice as many bird species as there are mammal species. And you have to argue that sexual selection is a powerful force in driving birds into different arrangements of behavior and beauty. So why are there so many birds? It's what happens if females are put in charge.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's it. But I couldn't help asking some questions for myself. So then, given what we've learned about birds, why are men 15% bigger than women? There's a series of questions like this. And it turns out the answer is much more complicated than you want. And there are many scientists who say that you can't answer this question today, because to do a proper answer, you'd have to compare cultures all over the world. And we are now flying back and forth and intermarrying, and it's so confused that you can't figure it out. But some of the prospective answers are that because males are bigger, there must have been some point in our evolution where males were fighting with each other. And all you have to do is imagine a scene at a country western bar where some guy says, "Hey, that's my girl, get away." And a fight breaks out or whatever. So what I'm working on is the best evidence we have for how can you explain some human features that are both sexual dimorphism and other characteristics that are different between us. But I haven't gotten there yet. So, question. Oh, now's my opportunity to bring the microphone out here. And if you
We're gonna try to leave this to Mark and judge what the best way to handle the microphone is and everything.
yes, so Mark, can you hear us clearly?
Absolutely.
Okay. Somebody say something.
Well, go ahead, Jim.
No, I was just gonna say, I suggest you leave one of your dramatic pictures up on the left side instead of a blank screen.
Okay.
It'll be there. And then I had a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the first slide you had with population numbers had fish bigger than birds. And the last one you had, the birds dwarfed the fish. And I was wondering if there's any thought about.
Oh, it has to do with what study we're talking about. Oh, I need to stand over here.
She wants to know why. And the short answer is rivers. Fish will live in rivers that cause lots of isolation. And so you end up with lots of fish species.
And oceans.
Yes, but they're not the one reason why they're certain.
And there are a lot more fish, and the water habitat is a lot older for evolution than any of the modern species. It's also true that the graphic was from a particular study.
Yeah, well, I get that those two are different, but I'm really interested, ocean versus rivers.
Yeah, the reason why there's so many fish is because there's so much isolation from one river to the next. And the birds, the reason why there's so many birds is because there's so many songbirds.
Yeah.
And so, you kind of have to move up into that part of the evolutionary tree, ask, what is it about Aster hornies that engenders a kind of dynamic that spins on lots of species. And one of the things is that they're singing to one another. And so.
And the song matters for me.
That also interacts with the plumage things. Anyway, I digress. How are we doing, Mark? Or can you hear the questions, or do you need them to be repeated?
I can hear them, but the quality is not great, so probably they should be repeated.
Oh, okay.
You know, so then the problem with that is that to repeat them and be effective, you have to hold on to the microphone, or even maybe use that one that's.
Yeah, I'm trying to stand next to the primary microphone. Is my voice clear, Mark?
Your voice is clear, yes.
Okay, so let's do,
Mine is not,
Should I stop the recording?
Marcus might not.
what's that?
Should I stop the recording?
Yeah, if you're hearing voices, okay, I think it is a good time to stop.